today, but there is still a little bit to be mentioned to complete the picture of what is the link between markets and government. How can we, in a very realistic approach, understand functioning of economic systems. In my first talk, I explained an argument in favor of depolitization of the interest rate, and that was a follow-up to a lecture before, which argued in favor of depolitization of money. So market money plus market interest rate was something which we explained is a precondition for the macroeconomic stability. In my second talk, I argued for the depolitization of choices, so that you can do what you want in areas such as buying, selling goods, hiring people to work in your factory, or deciding what you do with your resources you have under your control as a private owner. In this third lecture, I do my best to explain arguments in favor of depolitization of spending. I mentioned that during the 20th century, public spending went up dramatically. It was always boosted during times of crisis, wars, economic crisis, or governmental programs that are called crisis or war, such as war on drugs, war on terrorism, and so on and so forth. My task today will be give you arguments against the most common excuse for governmental spending, and that is the existence of so-called public goods. So you may know that too often politicians present this reasoning. They argue there are some goods that markets can easily produce, shoes and ice creams and perhaps bread, though we have to regulate a little bit so that people do not get poisoned. But pretty much that's a role for market or markets to do, provide people with this easy stuff. On the other hand, they claim there are some goods that are a little bit more than standard goods. Something which is sort of a good for, not for one person only, but for the whole society as such. They call that public goods and argue it is beyond capacity of individual producer to supply the rest of society with these special goods. Hence, if we leave it up to the market, some things will not be produced, and hence governments have to step in, tax you first, and use the money to provide these so-called public goods. I guess this is a very common argument. I'm sure it's used often here as well. This simply idea of something unusually big public goods. And the list of products supplied which are necessary to be supplied, at least they argue, through this governmental spending is a very long, from streets or roads rather to sometimes schools and healthcare, and the ultimate example is things like national defense, which allegedly everybody understands can't be provided privately. Now, how can we deal with these issues? How can we disprove the argument? So let me try to do it in numerous ways, show you that actually we have, as economists, very good arguments against that. We have also some arguments as political philosophers against that as well. And that there are things connected to it called the problem of externalities, positive and negative externalities, which very nicely fit into the topic of governmental expenditures, subsidies and taxation, and that will be what I will explain in the second half of my talk, and we might get to topics such as environmental protection at the very end, including this today very hot topic of global warming. So first, a very easy way how to refute the argument of public good is the following one. If something is to be public good, meaning good in some sense useful for everybody, it must be in the first place, in the first instance, a good. So only a good can become a public good, right? Now, what is a good? Well, economists know that for something to qualify as a good, it's not necessary to have particular qualities, so that, you know, if something is made of wood, or if something is painted white or green, that does not actually give something a quality to be a good. In order for something to be a good, the thing which nature gives us must be perceived by somebody as something useful. So good is a scarce resource perceived as useful by an individual. That's a good. You may know that there are many other, or there may be other categories except goods. Economists also speak of bads, which is something which is not useful, right? So, for example, crime is a bad, something which gives you negative utility, negative satisfaction. So what you immediately see that what is crucial here is a link between an individual and a thing. So imagine that I say, I use the textbook example and say, national defense is public good. How can you disprove it? Well, there might be in this group, or if there is one pacifist in a given society, and he says, sorry, I've heard something about public good to be useful for everybody. Public good, national defense is public good. I do not agree. I'm pacifist. Defense is a bad for me. It's something which I do not like to have. It brings negative utility to me. Then what do you do? As a scientist, do you say, oh, you're a crazy pacifist, I don't count you? I count only people who like armies? You can't do it, right? Or you may say, oh, but there are just few pacifists here, and there is many more people who like armies, and they appreciate defense, and they somehow outvote them. All right, but then you're talking politics, not economics, right? Because then what decides is majorities, not some like meaning of a concept. And you don't know what to do with the situation if you want to defend the public good argument, because simply you don't have any argument against that. Any argument which then you use amounts to your value judgment. You simply say, I like it to call it that way, and I don't count you my preferences are stronger than your preferences, or something along these lines. And as you know, there is no way how you can be scientific economists and at the same time impose your value judgments. Right? So the existence of one pacifist actually refutes the whole theory of public goods, because simply it would necessarily involve value judgment on the part of somebody to ignore somebody else, and you can't do it. So public good as an economic concept is meaningless for this very easy reason. This is for one. Second, the theory of public goods, or the concept of public goods, was developed by famous textbook author, Nobel Prize winner Paul Samuelson. And Paul Samuelson, back in the 50s, wrote a article called The Pure Theory of Public Expenditures, in which he said approximately the following. He said, on the one hand, we have goods like the standard goods, which have two characteristics. You can exclude people from using it, and there is rivalry in consumption. So if I eat it, there is not anything available for you. So one can have it. If one has that, the other doesn't have it. These are standard goods, and he said, on the other side of the spectrum, there we might think of those two features to be different. That means no rivalry. If I eat it, there is still plenty for you, and there is impossibility to exclude people from consumption. So if once it's produced, anybody can just start using it. There is still enough left for others, and you can't simply stop somebody from consuming the good. And he said that we will call public goods. So theoretically, okay, this is how the concept has emerged. When Samuelson himself had to give examples, he had problems, because you actually cannot really find anything that would fit the category. Even if we put the argument which I have just explained about whether it's beneficial for somebody or not, even if we put that aside, you still do not have real good examples, because always, or it seems that almost always you can exclude, and that almost always there is rivalry in consumption. There are some goods which do not face these restrictions, but these are not real goods. It's like sunshine. If you enjoy sunshine, other people can as well. There is still plenty for the rest of us. But we would not call sunshine a good, because sunshine is not a scarce resource. Economists would call things such as sunshine free goods. You don't need to economize, because it's plenty of it. Right? So even when you take the original definition of Samuelson, you have problems to fit anything in it to really satisfy the concept. And economists for years tried to figure out whether you cannot solve that somehow, and what actually they over time decided to do, and we have this famous founder of public choice, James Buchanan, responsible for, he said, all right, stop the endless discussions about what is and what is not public good. Let's call anything that governments buy or produce public good, even if it doesn't fit any features which Samuelson describes. Simply whatever government uses its money for and produces, let's call that public good, and let's try to, as economists, to explain government how to spend their resources in the least wasteful way. So he said, it's not that public goods is some kind of market failure and it has to be supplied by government. He kind of said, no, don't talk about market failures in this respect. Just take it as given. For whatever reason, political reasons, government provide tables or chairs or education or healthcare for people. So don't speculate whether there is rivalry, whether there is possibility to exclude people. Just take it as given and try to design rules for the government so that they do not waste money in a completely stupid way. And now you see a problem. Some people might still believe the old Samuelsonian definition that public goods are goods with some features, whereas economists can mean by this a completely different thing, that it's just a concept which is politically defined, and then, as I said, role for economists is to advise to have smart expenditure policies. Once again, there is some definition standardly used, Samuelsonian, but it doesn't really have real content. And often economists use the public good concept in a different way, which is politically defined, and hence cannot be a reason for governmental intervention because simply it's a result of governmental decision already. Right? Hope you understand what I mean. So there might be a lot of confusion regarding the use of these concepts. Now, still, what often you may consider to be a reason for governmental interference is that in some cases there might be problems when a certain good is produced, which economists call a free rider problem. Free riding. That means somebody produces a good and other people can use it without paying for it. Such as you study and invest into your education, your neighbors, without contributing to it, they benefit from having smart neighbor because you are simply a nice guy, right? That'll be one example. So yes, free riding can exist. And if you think about it, actually our world is full of free riding, right? I free ride on your investment into your clothes or into whatever your hygienic habits, all that I never contributed to, but I like if you do not smell, if you look nice, if you are smart, all that's that's perfect for me, and I'm free riding on it. And in some sense, you might free ride on what I'm doing. So the very existence of some problems of this sort is not a reason for governmental intervention. It's simply a fact of life. People live in societies and you don't pay for everything, you enjoy. Now, the typical argument would be that many goods, or at least some goods, because of this free riding problem, can be a source of positive externality. So, and if that is so, you as a producer of the goods will not get paid for all the benefits you provide to society. Okay, could be. And hence, economists argue, if that is the case, in some cases the good, which actually is useful for many people, will not be produced. So society will be poorer, because some goods will not emerge or will not be produced without state interference. Simply markets, because of free riding problem, will not be able to produce some things. If everybody paid, products will be produced. Some products, some services. But if only half of people pay and the other half free rides, things will not be produced. What can you say to that? Okay, actually Professor Hoppe has a very nice take on this issue. And he says, okay, then situation A is that people are not, or people operate voluntarily, they interact, and as a result they produce a lot of things, but they do not produce some things. There is no violence in that society, there is no, let's say, taxation in that society. People simply spend the money on what they consider to be a good investment or consumption good. On the other hand, you have society B, and society B says, or not society, but politicians in that society say, we can't tolerate this free riding. People, we will tax you, we will use your money and invest it as we see perfect. So for example, they would tax you in order to pay for research and cosmic projects so that you land, or people from your society land on the moon first. Now Hoppe says, what is a kind of better society? In what society you have more justice? The one where everything is based on harmonious, mutually beneficial, voluntary exchanges, and some goods do not exist and other goods exist, or in society B, where you have violence, you have threat of the use of force, you have taxation, and as a result you are the first on the moon, or whatever else. He says it seems to be clear from property right perspective that the first society is better, because nobody is forced to pay money against his will to somebody who then politically decides to spend it or waste it or do whatever he fits. And I guess this is a fundamental argument as well. The mere fact that when using violence, you may have something which you do not have when violence is not used. It's not an argument for violence. Right? Imagine the analogical situation. In one society that enslaves people, they can build the longest tunnels through mountains because they can force slaves to dig deep into the ground. And as a result, they'll have tunnels as nobody else. Right? Okay, perhaps nice for tunnels lovers. But what is it? I mean, is it that slavery, this society with slavery is better because of these tunnels? Or the other society that doesn't have slavery, they simply perhaps have to go up the hill and down the hill, and it's more costly for them than to go through the mountain. So what? They don't have slaves, which might have, some positives, such as property is respected, ownership is respected. Nobody lives at the expense of anybody else. Just they go this way when going shopping to the neighboring village, whereas the slave society has tunnel. Tunnels are not necessarily, the values for which you have to violate those fundamental principles Professor Hoppe was talking about: self-ownership, property, and contract. Right? So I hope now you understand the point. The fact that some things can be done only with violence must be understood as, not as a reason for violence as such. Simply, peaceful societies may not be able to do some things. There's nothing wrong about it. Right? And the cosmic research is actually a very nice example. I mean, what people had from. I mean, Americans went to the moon first. They put the flag there and didn't know what to do else. So they went there a few times. Nothing came out of it. It was just not that fun when the fifth rocket landed on the moon. So they stopped doing it. And they still, even today, don't know why to go there. Whereas in a society which would not confiscate resources to show Russians that we are really tough guys, we are there first. Normal society, peaceful society, harmonious society would perhaps go to the moon as well, but maybe 70 years later or something, when it really makes sense to go there because you can use it somehow, right? The free rider problem is not sort of obvious excuse for governmental intervention. We would argue that property right respect is a real value for which has to exist in a society, whereas these fancy projects which can be done only when slavery or taxation exists, is not a good argument for having principles of just society violated. Now, let me now talk about externalities, and we use actually a very similar argument. The argument typically, as I said, is there will be on the production of something, if you can free ride on a producer of positive externality, what typically is used as textbook example is research, education, things like these. You don't need to go into the property argument, which I have just done. But you might stick to the economic argument and say, all right, you claim something has a positive externality, now you force me to pay for it. How do you know I have a positive effect from the activity? A nice argument always used in this respect is, all right, imagine there is a nice rose garden inside the block of houses. Somebody wants to take care of it, but without other people contributing, doesn't pay for him to take care of roses. So, there seems to be an argument for a policeman to go around and ask everybody who can watch the rose garden from his apartment to pay. Now imagine you knock somebody's door and say, hey, you are a free rider, you have to pay for this positive externality you have while watching the nice roses there. And the guy says, yeah, but you know what, I hate roses. I'm allergic to roses. It doesn't bring me anything good. I just, I can't sleep, I cough all the time. It's horrible, it's negative externality. What can you say? Once again, as with my anarchist, a pacifist example at the beginning, you might say, you are crazy, I don't believe you, or whatever, I ignore you. But that's your value judgment. You simply attempt to overrule his preferences by yours. And that means that a pure economic argument, which has nothing to do with property, it's just with the subjectivity of utility, can also be used to defeat the argument of a necessary, say, taxation in order for things with positive externalities to be produced. And you can't avoid these sort of problems. Simply, once again, economics is a science based on subjective perception of usefulness of things given to us by nature or produced by other people. Simply, positive externality cannot be established by a fact that something smells nice in chemical, physical, whatever way you can measure it. You always need somebody, a person, who demonstrates that he either likes it or not. If not, if he demonstrates that he doesn't like it, you can't claim that roses are positive externality, that the research is positive externality. You simply can't do it. You can politically decide that it'll be that way, that you ignore what people believe, that you will take them anyway, even if they are allergic to roses. And that's what's actually happening in our society. But then, don't try to argue using economics, because economics cannot give you this sort of argument. Majority decide. Economics is not about majorities. It's about individual perception of something. However, there is a way how markets handle the issue of positive externalities. Imagine you're a girl walking down the street, and somehow you see that you are attractive to many people. Not everybody. If I walk there with my wife and I watch your legs, and it makes me happy, but my wife is not particularly happy about this happening. So you see, subjective perception of something which I consider to be beauty, not her. If that happens, so you are a walking source of positive externality for some people, you might say, hey, what about using this situation? What about trying to internalize this positive externality? So what do? You rent a little room somewhere in the basement. You say, this is club, and every midnight I will walk there, here and back, showing my legs. And hey, people, remember me walking down the street? Same girl, I'll be even more beautiful at midnight. Please pay while entering the bar or whatever club. And by having guards standing there charging you, you internalize the externality, the beauty of your legs. Or might be a singer singing somewhere, could be a professor lecturing here, being paid by Remigijus rather than lecturing on the main square, somehow hoping that he will give me money voluntarily. Right? Internalization of positive externality is a thing which is a solution to the problem, but it's not a social problem. It's kind of challenge for the source of positive externality to use the boundary of private property to be able to reap profits from the activities, services which he is a source of. Right? So positive externality is kind of, when realized by the source of positive externality, is an entrepreneurial challenge. And entrepreneurs then can use private property concept to internalize it and make a nice living out of it. Some fail, some will ensemble remain in business, and that's exactly what the market process is about, right? So it's far from being some sort of market failure. Economists see or should see that to be a market challenge and potential for reaping monetary profits and hence actually helping to a good or better allocation of resources in the economy. I'm more useful as this for the rest of society in that bar showing my legs or me here giving a lecture than just walking by or talking to strangers elsewhere. This change of the institutional structure, me being now part of that property framework, is my contribution to the well-being of mankind. I'm more useful here than elsewhere, if Remigijus keeps paying me. If not, if I lecture here in front of empty classroom, that's a market signal that I should perhaps show my legs or something. Try whether it would not work better. Yes.
Oh, what if you give the lecture not for a class, but for 200 people, and you get paid the same amount? So wouldn't it be better for society? More people get your ideas and so on. They discuss with you, and you get the same salary.
I do not see the world through number of people watching me here. I and everybody, and I explained that, we all see the world through prices. That means I go and lecture for those who give me more. And it doesn't matter how many people there are, because perhaps Remigijus is able to put together a group of 5 people, but very important people, who would greatly benefit from my talks. And this 5 people is just, and myself lecturing in front of them is the best allocation of resources we can have, right?
May I add something? There were twice as many people actually willing to participate, but we intentionally cut the amount of people actually to 35 people. So this is also kind of contribution to this explanation.
Right. Remember Hayekian insight in a group which is bigger than family, small village. We have no idea about how useful we are for others directly. We don't know what resources are available. We see the world through prices. And prices help us allocate our services to the best possible users. Now, the opposite scenario will be negative externalities. I've touched that already. You immediately see that, once again, we cannot define some activity as a negative externality just by measuring it, watching it, taping it. Meaning, not every noise is a negative externality. Not every piece of pollution on your window is a negative externality, because what is crucial is how do you perceive it, whether you agreed to that to be on your window or whether you agreed that noise to get to you, right? Meaning the same activity may mean different things for different people. Myself producing noise here in front of you is not noise for you, because that's exactly what you expect from me to do. Perhaps a little bit more than noise, but noise is definitely a part of it. Or if you move to a town which is more noisy, it's more dirty, and you buy it, the apartment with these qualities anyway. You move in, then noise and dirt is not negative externality, because you bought it with it. It is what was a part of the deal, actually. Right? As Hoppe explained, these things were there first, you then entered the scene and you bought your place with these qualities. In a different scenario, when, for example, you own an apartment which is quiet and which is clean, and somebody starts polluting it, so actually the same piece of dirt on your window or on your clothes or somewhere is not a negative externality in the first case and is in the second case. Right? So once again, economic perception is crucial, not some physical or chemical qualities. Now, when we realize it, we actually can immediately see that what many people consider to be pollution, which somebody has to do something about it, it's not pollution at all. People who voluntarily accept certain environment, they accepted that. So it's not a negative externality. It's not pollution in the economic sense. To some people, it can be pollution. And how do we handle situations when you have pollution or negative externality? So somebody without your consent is attacking your property by doing something, producing noise, throwing empty Coke cans onto your garden, or doing whatever else to just attack your physical body or your property. Well, the solution is standard classical. Actually, law is nothing else than a way how to solve problems with negative externalities. So assaults against you and your property. By first figuring out whether that is true, and second, if it is true, then we have this whole system of provision of justice to stop the invader from invading it. So the enforcement of property or enforcement of property rights is a solution to negative externality. A standard solution, you don't need any new concepts for it. Yes, technology evolves, the kinds of pollution evolve as well. So you need law, or the whole, rather than law, the judges and policemen and all these to adapt to new reality. So apply the old concept onto new situations, use modern technology to better understand what is an attack to your property and what is not. So yes, you need this sort of development or evolution in the sphere of justice, so certain flexibility in a sense. But the core of the solution is very classical. Erect property boundaries and protect them is a solution to both positive and negative externalities. Now, in today's politics, this is not actually what is happening. We still have our solutions to these issues based on the work and conclusions of British economist Arthur Cecil Pigou, who wrote his books 100 years ago, who was a famous economist, and he came up with this idea to subsidize those who are sources of positive externalities, hence today's subsidy to education or research, and tax those who are sources of negative externalities, hence today's attempts to tax CO2 producers. The reason being that while when you tax somebody, you actually increase his costs, and hence he will limit the production to some socially optimal level. This is what Pigou was saying. On the other hand, if you subsidize schools and research, you will actually make their operation cheaper, and hence they will produce more of it. So there will not be under optimal level of research, and there will not be over optimal level of pollution. It will be brought back to where it would be when free riding would not exist, and when imposition of costs upon others without their consent would not exist. It is interesting because today when you often present some argument, classical argument in defense of property, for example, or in defense of free market system, the opponents would claim that, oh, but this is the old-fashioned idea that belongs to the second half of the 19th century. It's too old to be useful for our today's purposes. So advocates of free markets are often called outdated idealists or something. Whereas Pigou, who is an economist as old as these ideas, is now a huge source of actually contemporary policies that are considered super new and super modern, not outdated, and so on and so forth. Also, as a footnote, however, footnote which I believe deserves a lot of attention, that perhaps it's a nice research topic for a master's thesis or whatever other research. People often see externalities, especially negative externalities, as a sort of market failure. I said that that's not so. It's just failure of institutional arrangement, that is not sufficient enforcement of property rights. And today's politicians fix it by imposing taxes, as if taxes are not source of external. So what I'm claiming here that negative externalities are a necessary consequence of taxation, or is a defining feature of taxation. Simply, if you tax somebody using the argument that there are negative externalities existing in the economy, and you solve it by it, you actually create, first, you do not necessarily solve the original problem, that you don't know how much to tax, and by the way, you tax him, but you keep the money for the state budget, so you do not compensate anybody who could possibly suffer as a result of the activity of the guy. But second, more importantly, you create huge and huge negative externality, because simply people are forced to pay out of their pockets taxes. So if you, for example, tax cars, because cars burn fossil fuels or something, you use this argument, then like the whole population is now subject to negative externality. Against your will, somebody is imposing costs on you. So we have here something to do with politically created negative externalities. So if you would want to really see the whole picture, all right, you might compare what are the negative externalities of some market activity, if you can somehow calculate it, and I'm not sure how you would do it, but okay, let's imagine you can do it. And on the other hand, calculate the consequences of the negative or the extent of negative externalities as a result of taxation and compare them, right? That will be a valid task for an economist. But to say just only markets have negative externalities and I solve it by taxation doesn't make sense, because you simply are silent about a huge amount of externalities which you have just created by this political act. Now, I said that a big research area which is connected to the problem of negative, so-called negative externality, is the area of environmental protection. That is, there is a common belief that markets are failing in terms of keeping our environment suitable for life. Many people believe, and the Green parties and Green movement are the strongest proponents of the idea that there is a sort of spiral, that the environment gets worse and worse and worse, and people somehow cannot stop it without the need of having a Minister of Environmental Protection and some tools of environmental policy. And indeed, in economics, we have the whole, not one, but many branches that try to use economic arguments or economic tools and apply them onto the area of environmental protection. I would like, I don't have time to cover that all, but I just want to present you few ideas by one man who you should study or at least be aware of what he contributed to economic science. He's by no means follower of Mises or Hayek, but that does not disqualify him as an economist. His name is Julian Simon. And Julian Simon, or actually I may now mention a few names, even with the Austrian connection, so that you know that it can be studied abroad from different perspectives. Julian Simon was a man who was very much hated by the Green movement because his major claim was that we are not running out of resources. Actually, even with our consumption of resources, there is more available, which was a complete opposite view from what the Club of Rome and these people argue. They believe that, and predicted that in 20, 30 years, there'll be no oil, no aluminium, no nothing. The world will be at the very end. And Simon said, that's wrong. It's the other way around. We have more and more, which is perhaps a little bit more contra-intuitive. One of his or one of the people who wanted to disprove Simon, Greenpeace member from Denmark, is called Bjørn Lomborg. A leftist, social democrat, political theorist, statistician, young man, one of the most influential young men that is under 35 on earth in many opinion polls or magazine surveys, very much influential. And the interesting thing is that Bjørn Lomborg wanted to disprove once and for all the ideas of Simon, and while doing that, converted himself into the strongest supporter and follower of Julian Simon. So Simon is dead now, unfortunately. Bjorn Lomborg is well and alive and very active. For example, when Al Gore was testifying before American Congress, Bjorn Lomborg was his opponent. You can go to YouTube and see what he had to say about global warming. Very interesting presentation. And last name I want to mention, and there is the connection to the Austrian camp, though not everybody is very sort of enthusiastic about it, is Terry Anderson, who is a former student of Robert Hicks. And Robert Hicks is a historian, so perhaps might be. Hicks produced Anderson at the University of Washington. Hicks now, these days, one of the greatest economic historians working in the Misesian tradition. He's an author of, or he's a famous author for explaining how come that the government keeps growing or has grown that much in the 20th century. And Terry Anderson set up a new branch of economics called free market environmentalism. They all these three sort of work in the same broadly defined framework, and the framework is using sound economics to explain environmental issues or consequences of governmental regulation. By the way, Terry Anderson is now with the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and his books on environment, or at least one, is online. And it's called "You Have to Admit It's Getting Better." Nice title, tells you everything. And by the way, Terry Anderson also wrote a very nice introductory book on the importance of private property, evolution of property rights and consequences, also available at the website of the Hoover Institution. And what these people claim is that we can use the most famous, or the title of the most famous book by Simon to say that. The book is called Ultimate Resource. And they claim that the ultimate resource, meaning the only really scarce resource, is not aluminum, is not copper, is not oil, is not gold, but it's human inventiveness. That the crucial insight to understand the link between environment and humanity is that it is people who convert things given to us by nature into something useful. The things as such are not useful. Oil used to be a black, smelly nuisance on fields of farmers in the Middle East or elsewhere. Nobody knew what to do with it. If you found it on your land, you were not really happy about it. Only the ingenuity of Western engineers transformed this useless, smelly stuff into something which now billions of people find useful every day. So the source of that importance of oil is not oil as such, but human brain. Right? And Simon documents that historically what we see is steadily declining prices of all major commodities, meaning resources, natural resources. So if you see a historical price of aluminium, it goes down and down and down. Not always, there are little ups and downs, but when you see how much it costs today, whereas as compared to what it used to cost 50 years ago or 100 years ago, there is this downward trend. And it's true for everything. Economists already now should feel what, where the argument is. We see world through prices. If prices fall, that means there is more of the stuff available. There is the thing which gets cheaper is more plentiful. There is less scarcity of it. Meaning, if you see what has historically been happening with prices, you can conclude, as Simon did, that we have more and more of everything which we believe, or many believe, and green parties and green whoever believe, that we are running out of it. Economists claim that's the other way around. And once again, the reason is not that we would have now more of a physical quantity of copper, because yes, we have used some of it. Some got destroyed in the production. That's very true. But what matters, and that's the same thing as with externality issue. What matters is not the thing as such, is a perception of somebody or a link between somebody and a thing. So how people perceive it, how useful or positive or negative they see it. And when prices fall of aluminium, for example, it means that for purposes that people have, today there is more aluminium than before. Though physically, globally, there can be less of it. But for economic purposes, there is more of it. Nice way to document it is, for example, to measure the thickness of Coca-Cola can over the years. And you see how thick it was 30 years ago and how thick it is today. And suddenly you see that when the thickness gets smaller, even with declining amount of aluminum available, you can actually produce more cans. Right? That means you have, in principle, in economic terms, more aluminum available. To produce the same amount of cans, you need more. I mean, you need less so that you have more left. Right? And there is a nice bet between Julian Simon and a famous biologist called Ehrlich, who is a guy who was predicting back in the 70s and 80s the end of civilization, because he wrote a book which actually depicted the situation that you arrive to a gas station, you stick the nozzle into your tank of a car, push it, and there'll be no oil, no gas. And he says, this is coming before the year 2000. He said 30 years ago. And I recommend you, I don't have time for it, but go to Wikipedia and find Simon Ehrlich wager. Simon Ehrlich bet regarding resource depletion. They actually bet real money whether Simon is right or Ehrlich is right. It's one of the most famous bets in the history of economic thinking, because it very nicely demonstrated the power of economic thinking as opposed to sort of thoughts of natural scientists who cannot appreciate enough the entrepreneurial spirit and all these adaptation which economists often understand. All right, go to Wikipedia, see what it was about and how it ended up. I gave you a hint that Simon was right, and that's what you should remember. Now, I guess I have a few more minutes, and I want to leave some time for questions. you might perhaps be interested how or what we have as economists, what we have to say about global warming, which is a big thing today. And I have to admit that it's a difficult thing, and there are different views on it within the same camp, so to speak. Now, for one, there are still famous natural scientists who do not buy the whole story, that disprove the facts that global warming is man-made. I have not much to say about it. I just know some people who are professors of climatology, and by the way, there is not many professors of climatology in the world. It's a relatively small group of people. There's thousands of people who participate in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They are typically not climatologists. There actually was one study written by a scholar showing what kind of people are there. And he discovered that there are like web designers and secretaries in that panel, which is then sold to general public as the leading world experts. There are some experts for sure, but not everybody is an expert, and some experts who perhaps started working for the panel, they left because they started to feel very dramatically how politicized the whole thing became and don't want to have anything to do with it. And there are some who never really bought the idea. So this is one point, which economists can't decide, right? You would need to have a climatologist here to say, well, how is it? By the way, I mentioned this wager or bet between Simon and Ehrlich. There is an ongoing bet between Russian scientists and some American scientists regarding the nature of global warming. Russians claim that it's all sunspots, that it has nothing to do with CO2 emissions, and have a theory for it. And these are people from Russian Academy of Science. Once again, I can't judge, just realize that there are theories arguing in principle that the atmosphere of Mars is getting warmer as well, and there are no people there, so people can't be responsible for it unless they are Martians. Right? Some people would argue because Mars is warming up, that means Martians exist. That's not exactly what it is. Now, Lomborg presents one way how to approach the issue. He says, all right, then, these things might happen or might be happening. Imagine that the world is really warming up. And he says, okay, then let's see what we know. You have here the 21st century. This is 2000. This is 2100. And you have warming. This is the warming when you have Kyoto Protocol, and here there are different estimates of how much the temperature would go up, but he says, well, that's something about the reasonable expectation is something like 2 centigrades, perhaps not even. Okay, possible. Then let's see what happens if you, or put it this way, this is what, let's say this is what is business as usual. This is when you do nothing, that'll be the result. Now, if you have Kyoto adopted under certain conditions, the result will be something like this. That means that what we are talking in economic terms is this difference, meaning that with Kyoto, what you normally would get in 2106 you get, or sorry, with 1,100, 2,100, you get 6 years later. So, economically speaking, what is reasonable to, or how reasonable to approach the situation is to understand it as an investment. You know what you are buying. You buy 6 years, something which would normally happen sooner will happen later, a little bit. So this is benefits, this is what you get. And on the other hand, you have costs of Kyoto. Right? And Thornburg says economists should simply try to tell us whether it makes sense, whether these huge amounts of money spent today are worth to buy us 6 years, 100 years from now, given the fact that here, under the predictions of those models, the poorest countries in the world, on average, will be as rich as the United States today. Right? So the point is, even if you have a problem, it's not always optimal to fix it now, because by fixing it now, you deprive yourself of something, economic development in this sense, and hence you will not be able to do that much fixing in the future. Right? So it might be perfectly feasible and optimal strategy. Wait until the U.S. and the Western world is 10 times richer as today. The developing world is as rich as we are today, and then do something, because then you can really fix it. It might happen that by doing something now, you actually will never be able to fix it, so you might make the situation worse. Right? So this kind of trade-off is important, and it's not very frequently mentioned. It will be a sort of general economic approach, cost-benefit analysis. So this is approach number one for economists. It should be their role to say, all right, these things have cost, there are some benefits, let's see what we buy, and let's see what it costs. On the other hand, now when I speak using this language, it looks as if it was an individual kind of project, investment project. But we are not talking individual project, we are talking governmental interference, taxation, and all these things here. So it still has a different dimension to the whole project. But this is definitely an important one. And by the way, Lomborg started a project called Copenhagen Consensus. It's a big project, Nobel Prize winning economists participate, and many other scientists. And he says, all right, there are many problems in the world. Global warming is one, AIDS is another, malaria is another, water shortage is another, trade barriers is another, poverty is another. Now let's see which problems are the most important ones and which are not as important. They might be important as well, but given limited amount of resources you might spend on it, which ones are the most urgent one? He called a book which he wrote, Imagine to be Bill Gates for a while. For a while is not the title, I guess it's called Imagine to be Bill Gates. So you have a certain amount of money, whatever, $50 billion. You want to do good. You want to do as much good as possible. Right? How do you do good? Do you spend the money on prevention of global warming, AIDS, malaria, trade barriers, and so on and so forth? Not an easy question. You have to know what are the costs and what are benefits of the solutions. Right? And the the result of the consensus is actually prioritizing of world's priorities. Meaning simply to say what is the most urgent thing, what is the second most urgent. So if you have these $50 billion, how to spend it, what you might have just for 5 out of 10, so in what sequence you spend. Very nice exercise in cost-benefit analysis, very nice exercise in the existence of trade-offs and showing what is the economic approach to it. However, once again, you are not Bill Gates. Bill Gates is not spending his own money. It's governments who spend money. So it can very well be that the cost of taxation might outweigh the results, the good which can be produced. Or perhaps there is no way how you can do good in the world because you have political processes in countries going on. So even if Lomborg, with his smartest Nobel Prize winning economist, would tell you this is priority number 1, this is priority number 2, perhaps there is no way how you can do this good because local governments would rather do different things, support farmers to win next elections and so on and so forth. Perhaps you can do it, that's possible too. Another set of arguments connected to global warming is the following. Imagine for a while that there are no cars, no factories, no chimneys emitting CO2. Imagine the only emission of CO2 is you. You breathe and you emit CO2. And imagine that the theory is valid, so with more CO2 emissions, there will be warming up of the planet. Right? What do you do? Now, what defenders of, well, you can kill half of the people and say, wonderful, we solve global warming problem. That can be the case, but you see that that's not really a good solution because it's violation of self-ownership and all that goes with it. It's simply mass murder, right? So that is why some economists connected to the Austrian school, students of Ludwig von Mises, they say, well, if this is the solution, if this is a situation, or a situation is close to this, the fact that we somehow collectively contribute to changing of our environment is not a crime against anybody, it's not an assault on anybody, there is no, it's not like some raper raping somebody, it's just that our environment is changing and we should use the well-proven method of responding to changes of environment to adapt to it. So let's have market mechanism and capitalism to somehow solve the problem. So perhaps there will be some rise of the sea level. Actually, there was during the 19th century, 15 centimeters. Nobody has ever mentioned that because people over time has adapted to it. It's not a big issue. Today, if you say during the 20th century it was 20 and during the 21st it might be 30 or 40, people see that's horrible, it never happened before, but it actually, we are in the middle of rising sea level. Nobody has ever complained about it today, but people are scared to death about the future. By the way, London is an interesting example because London, together with this part of British Isles, for some geological reasons, is actually sinking. So it's not that during the 20th century, not that the level of the sea would go up, but London went down, which in principle is the same thing, right, for Londoners. And the amount, or this sinking of London is equivalent to what it is expected to be the sea level rise during the 21st century, right? Have you ever read in London Times or Financial Times or whatever British newspaper that there is this huge catastrophe for London because there is this change of distance between London and the sea level? Never ever that was mentioned. because it's little bit per decade, and people adapted to it. So adaptation might be the easiest way, and market mechanism is famous for being very flexible, able to adapt. Right? On the other hand, some people would argue that you can treat the issue of sort of collective effects this way. Being a legal theorist, you have to treat that as other collective problems when you have a lot of people on one side and a lot of people on the other side. Right? So that you should, even if you are not able to say who contributed to or who exactly by contributing to the overall CO2 emission attacked you or your place or your property, there are still ways how you can sort of find those responsible, though you can't prove the one-to-one individual effect, let's say. Okay, there is, I guess, something to it as well. Legal theorists might be more able than economists to explain this. So this has nothing to do with economics, it has something to do with property rights and aggression when you have more people on both sides. And some people believe that that is the case. So I don't have the final answer. I just believe that we should first see cost benefits to have an idea of whether it's not complete nonsense to do something now. Second, we should appreciate political processes, operational political processes, that even if we know what is the global ideal solution, and who knows what that is, politicians are not necessarily the ones who will do it. And third, markets are famous for its flexibility. And if somebody comes up to find solution to the problem, if it exists, he will be rewarded for it. And there might be things like new ways how to store CO2, new ways how to plant more trees, who knows what. Politicians are famous for other things than flexibility and innovation. Corruption and all that goes with it. Markets are famous for something which we would need to know. You have economic part of it, you have political part of it, you have legal part of it. All is necessary to sort of study and understand well, to be able to cope with those huge problems such as global warming. Definitely it's not as easy that Al Gore produces this propaganda movie, then he gets the Nobel Prize for peace, and then somehow it allegedly is obvious that you have to tax people around the globe to give politicians money to spend it wisely. I mean, who can believe that that's a solution? Right. It's time to stop, I believe, and the floor is open for questions. Yes?
It's interesting for me right now, okay, if there are property rights, it's quite easy to decide, okay, if someone is polluting my territory, my property, it's easy to say, okay, stop it, or I sue you. But what to do with those territories which are no man's land? For example, have you heard about this plastic island?
Plastic island?
Yeah, there is a territory in the Pacific Ocean, bigger than Texas, I'm not going to write about it, and like it's a plastic island.
Okay,
like I don't know, like a water part, which has a lot of plastic little pieces, like it's a garbage,
okay.
and it belongs to nobody because it's water, it's Pacific Ocean, it's not America's, it's not other countries, and what to do with that, because it came from people, and yeah.
So what is the problem? I mean, there is some plastic island flowing on in the ocean.
If
Nobody
there
cares.
is a
What are you doing?
well, the problem is that like the animals are dying because they're eating those plastic little Lego pieces, which are colorful, looks tasty, but
Okay, I'm not
it's bad
really
for
tasty.
them. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
You know, but what can you do about it? By the way, before I came here, I watched BBC, and they had actually a similar story. In Kenya, along the seashore, there is a lot of plastic flip-flops coming to the shore from those millions of people swimming, I don't know where, so that there is like, you know, pollution of seashore by these plastic flip-flops. And actually, local people came up with a very nice invention. They collect these flip-flops and they turn them into art. They somehow are able to cut it and produce beautiful, colorful butterflies, which then they attach to some strings and they sell it to Western rich tourists. And they say, you know, before when we were working hard in agriculture on farms, you know, we were not able to make that much money. And at the same time, you know, it was very difficult work. Now, nature gave us this resource, flip-flops, and we can live better lives. Well, so, you know, if this plastic island will either start harming somebody, then you have a case that, you know, look for who caused that. With today's technology, you know, it can be the same case as with global warming. Everybody contributed a little bit, and we don't know what, but could be. But also, it can be that the factory produced that, and nobody was actually searching for the true originator of that pollution because nobody actually cared. Once it starts affecting somebody, people will start caring. It's like with pollution, smoke, right? You might say, you never know where smoke comes from. Well, today you have very nice technology to figure out, you know, who originated the smoke, which then traveled kilometers, hundreds of kilometers, and landed on your property. You can figure that out today. And actually, the FME people, the free market environmentalists, they claim actually that you may even see, even today, schemes that factories who emit smoke, they deliberately color or paint their smoke, they put some isotopes in it, so that whenever somebody accuses them of causing cancer or whatever, destroying somebody's property, they can send, you know, commissions, I would say chemistrians, I don't know, to investigate, you know, what it is, and if they don't find these isotopes in it, they say, okay, it's smoke, it caused cancer, but that's not our smoke. So it could be, you know, the same way as you have, I don't know, these, you know, when you have dogs have to have these coins or whatever, so that you know whose dog it is. It is the same thing, so that you cannot blame somebody just by watching a dog, and you know that the guy has a dog, so you say, you know, that dog bite me. So technology is, you know, not omnipotent, but it can solve a lot of issues. And always, you know, there is not God to solve it. You always have two possibilities. Either ingenuity of private entrepreneurs will come up with new ways how to solve problems, or bureaucrats will do it. And ask always the question, who is more likely to come up with a solution to a problem? I would bet my money on entrepreneurs rather than bureaucrats.
Could you say what would be free market decision regarding this plastic island if fishermen found that now they have less fish
Well,
and the ocean it's not their property?
Yeah, and that's the problem. I mean, you have most of the land owned by people, so that you can't have a flowing island on nobody's land. So these problems typically do not arise in private property settings. Where it arises is the ocean is nobody's, so that people treat it as common pasture. They keep throwing things onto the ocean because it's nobody. Economists call it tragedy of the commons. And then problems might arise out of it. Overfishing is one, overpollution. And this is a sort of overpollution. If it's nobody, Aristotle was able to see the consequence of the existence of nobody's property. So, I don't know how to fix it when the problem is already in existence on nobody's property, and just journalists watch it from the helicopters and write articles about it. It doesn't have a good solution.